Hello and welcome to the final instalment of the Elizabethans review and recap series. In this episode, I'm going to be talking you through how to answer each of the question strands on the Elizabethan paper. So our exam board is OCR B. The paper is called the Elizabethans 1580 to 1603. It's section B of paper 2, so it pairs it with crime and punishment. So this is the British death study and it focuses on a relatively short time period. It's chosen because this is a point where Britain's under severe pressure and face the possibility of invasion. The point of the study is to understand the complexity of society and the interplay of different forces within it. We learn how and why historians and others have interpreted the same events and developments in different ways. There's 5 components of the course. I've made a video for each of them and you need to make sure you know all of them because you can be tested in any of these areas. So Elizabethan government, Catholic, daily lives, popular culture and the wider world. Within that we focus on different aspects, so political, religious, economic, social and cultural factors. We also have this overarching question about the Elizabethan period being viewed as a golden age. We look at reasons to agree with this and reasons that we can challenge it. So we also look at a lot of interpretations in lessons, and this is because you're going to be presented with 3 in the exam. So we look at a range of academic, educational, popular and fictional interpretations. So you'll have an hour and 45 in total to attempt section A and B. It's completely up to you how you answer these questions. The important part though is that you allow enough time to have a go at all of them. The best advice I can give you is to make sure you attempt all questions. I know it's really tempted to get the bigger ones out the way, but it is really important that you have a go at all of them. This is because if you don't answer a question, you know you're going to get 0, or at least if you've been able to attempt all of them, there's a chance of picking up marks across the board. So that roughly translates to about 52-ish minutes for the Elizabethan paper. I'm going to give you some advisories on how long I think you should spend on each one. These are just guidance, so obviously these can be adapted to your needs. Just make sure you keep an eye on the time. So this is an interpretation-based paper. So you're going to be required to analyse interpretations throughout the paper, and you'll have a total of 3. So the questions you're going to face are as follows. So question 6A, the reason why the questions start from question 6 is because crime and punishment is section A. You'll have a 3-mark question on interpretation A. 6B is also on interpretation A, but this time it's a 5-mark question. Now I suggest you spend a maximum of 10 minutes on both of those questions, and that includes the time it takes for you to read the interpretation. Question 7 is a 12-mark question, so you'll be looking at interpretations B and C. I suggest you spend roughly 15 minutes on the question, and that will leave you approximately 25 minutes for question 8, which is a 20-mark question. You will get a choice out of 2 for this one, and this is the only purely knowledge-based question where there's no interpretation that accompanies it. So obviously these are just advisories. For example, if you know you're going to need more time than the 20 marker, you'll have to shave time off the smaller questions to allow for that. In total, there's 40 marks available on the paper, and it makes up a 1/5 of your entire GCSE. So I'm going to break the questions down a bit further for you. So let's start with the 3-mark question. So as I said to you before, this is a depth study and we focus on interpretations. We're looking at how the past is presented by writers and artists. So the first question on your exam will be worded somewhat like the example I'm going to give. This could be for an image or an extract. So it could say, interpretation A, the writer Tracy Borman presents Elizabeth as someone obsessed with a public image. Identify and explain one way in which she does this. So if you have an image, you're obviously going to study the picture and pick out points in which you could show, in this case, how she's obsessed with a public image. If you've obviously got a text, you're going to use a quotation to do this. It's always going to be on interpretations, not a source. So these are not from the time. You're not expected to know about the provenance, so who wrote it and when. Quite often it's just going to be a historian or an illustrator who you've never come across before. So it's not relevant to this question, so you do not need to discuss purpose. The pink underlined sections then are what we call the roots of the question, and they're always going to stay the same. So it will always start with in interpretation A, and then it will always say identify and explain one way in which, might not be she, but she does this or he does this. The green sections then is the focus of the question, and this will change depending on obviously the paper you are sitting. So it might not be on obsessed with a public image, it could be on a variety of different things, but that's what you're looking out for. You're looking out for what they want you to focus on in that question. So it's testing your ability to analyse an interpretation and extract evidence that proves the historian's statement. This is not trying to catch you out. This is a relatively straightforward question. I often find from my experience of exam marking, the people who do the best in this question don't overthink it. You need to take evidence directly from the interpretation. So you need to make sure you're referencing something specific or using a quotation that shows whatever the question is asking you. In this case, it's about being obsessed with a public image. So to answer the question, all you need to do then is firstly identify a feature in the interpretation, and then secondly, explain how this feature supports the interpretation. So you then just explain how it shows what you have stated. You do not need to use much contextual knowledge here at all. So you're not being awarded marks for how much you know, for example, about Elizabeth's public image. You are simply focusing on that interpretation. You can very, very easily pick up a mark here, so never just leave this question. You get got 1 mark for a valid ID from the interpretation that supports the statement. So simply, if you just went, I can see this, that shows she's obsessed with the image, you could get 1 mark. For those 2 to 3 marks then, so that explanation, you have to then say how the identified point supports the statement. The statement is obsessed with a public image in this example. You must link it back to the question, in other words. This is simply a very, very short paragraph, a couple sentences at max. Like I said, I expect you to spend no more than 10 minutes on questions 1 and 2, sorry, 6A, 6B, and that is including time to break down the question and the interpretation as well. So the second question on the Elizabethan paper asks you to plan an inquiry. It's going to be the same interpretation from the 3-mark question. However, the example I'm going to give you now is a different one, and it's actually an image just to show you a variation of some of the things you might be asked. So what does it actually mean by plan an inquiry? So it's asking you to ask a question and to basically say what you would investigate to help you learn more about the topic in question. This is very different to anything that we do in any of the papers. Just like with the first question, it's best to not overthink this and just go with whatever your gut instinct is here. So here's an example. So I will show you what this picture is going to be about. So if you were asked to do more research on one aspect of interpretation B, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us analyse and understand the persecution of Catholics in Elizabethan England. So if you have a look at the image there, it says a monument to Nicholas Owen at St Mary's Church, Harvington, 1825. The building at the back represents the Tower of London, where Nicholas Owen died under torture in 1606. So there you go, you can see a statue, and it's showing a Catholic dying under torture. So let's think about that question. So it says, if you're asked to do more research on one aspect of it, what would you choose to investigate? How is this going to help us understand and analyse the persecution of Catholics in Elizabethan England? So just as before, the pink parts I've underlined is the root of the question. It's always going to stay the same, so it's always going to be worded in this bizarre way. It's probably going to say interpretation A though. I've taken this from a textbook, which is why it says B. The green then underneath is going to be the focus of the question. That will be interchangeable. Obviously, if it was similar to the example I gave for the first question, it's not going to be an image, it's going to be this one from before, and it's going to be about Elizabeth's image. So that's the part that's going to change, but the way in which you structure it will stay the same. So what do you have to do? So first thing you have to do is justify your chosen line of inquiry by using your knowledge of specific people, events or situations. You also need to base your suggested line of inquiry on a second order concept. So this sounds really quite overwhelming, but what this means is you take just one aspect from the interpretation and then you say, this element I'm looking at, if I did research on this one thing, this would help me discover more about, in this case, it's persecution of Catholics, because you're not expected to apply detailed contextual knowledge here. In fact, you're not going to get credited if you just start using contextual knowledge. And I've seen this happen in the exam many times. That's not going to impress the examiner. That's not the skill they are testing here. So this could be that you say, okay, if I look at this one aspect, it will help me understand if this was typical of the time. Was this the same everywhere? You might say, you'd look at the diversity. Is this going to be the same for everybody? Is this going to be the same for upper classes, the middle classes, the lower classes? You might say, okay, I will look at this because I want to see what's changed, if that had stayed the same. Is it a continuity? You might say, I would look at this one aspect because it will allow me to understand why this happened. What was the cause of whatever's in the interpretation? It might be about the impact and how things are remembered. It can be absolutely anything at all. The list is quite endless, and you will get 1 to 2 marks for simply saying something that is valid. So just saying this one thing is something I would research. It's really easy to do that. What you need to make sure you're doing though is again referencing the interpretation. So if it's an image, you need to pick something out of that image, and if it's obviously a text, you need to pick something that you've read and say what you would do more research on. So you've got to almost pretend to be a historian here, and how that would help your line of inquiry if you were doing research. So for 3 to 4 marks, you have to explain what the inquiry would help us understand. So you choose something and then you say how it's going to help you. How would you learn more about the topic that you're being asked? So if you were being asked about the persecution of Catholics, why can the thing you've chosen allow you to learn more information? For 5 marks then, it must describe and quote from the interpretation to support your inquiry. Again, this is a small paragraph. It's slightly longer than the first question because it is 5 marks. It's really best to just choose one area and then say what you think you could learn from it. Don't overthink it. It is a very bizarrely worded question. The best responses I've seen have been very straightforward, and therefore it's easy to get at least 3 to 4 marks here. So let's have a look at the 12-mark question. So question 7 will ask you to compare 2 different interpretations, and it will name a theme that you have to reference. So it might be structured along the following way. So interpretations B and C both comment on blank. I've left that blank because that's the interchangeable part of the question. How far do they differ, and what might explain their differences? So the first part of that question, so how do they differ, how far do they differ? This means that you're going to compare each interpretation about what it tells you about whatever the topic of the question is. So you would have done this before in class. We did an example on the religious settlement, so it could be interpretations B and C both talk about or both discuss the religious settlement. How far do they deliver, and what might explain their differences? So this is where you're looking at similarities and the differences within the interpretations. So that's the first strand of the question. So the second strand, which is a higher skill, what might explain their differences? So this is where you then need to compare the provenance, so look at who created it, when and why, to actually explain why there might be a difference in the opinions that they have. So quite typically, because if you're looking at how they differ, one's might be noticeably positive, one might be noticeably a little bit more negative, or one might argue a certain thing and the other one argue the opposite. So let's have a look at the mark scheme. I know this question might seem a bit complex because there's several strands to it, but actually it's very easy to get 7 to 9 marks here. So for 1 to 3 marks, I would expect nobody to be aiming this low, because all that would mean is you've simply described or summarised the interpretations. So you've literally just paraphrased what they show. But that demonstrates to you how there's no excuse not to attempt this question, because even if you were struggling, by simply summarising or paraphrasing it, you can get 3 marks here. If you do not make a comparison, which I'll talk about in a moment, you're going to be capped to 3 marks. So for 4 to 6 marks, you are making a valid comparison, but there's no support. So this might be you accurately identifying points of difference, but you don't use quotations. So really straightforward to do. You need to use quotations, you need to use support to support your ideas. So 7 to 9 marks. I said it's really straightforward to get to this level, and this is why. You must have a valid comparison explained of B and C, and using quotations. If you use quotes for just one of them, it's 7 marks, and for both, it's 8 to 9. So if you can successfully say this one, for example, might be positive because here's a quote, and then you can say, however, this one is negative because here's a quote. That could be up to 9 marks if it's done well. Notice how if you don't use comparison words, you can't get more than 3 marks. Those last 3 marks then, so for 10 to 12 marks, is a more complex and difficult skill because you've got to look at purpose. So this is where you'd have to then make a valid comparison about B and C, so same steps as 7 to 9. You're going to use quotations, but you're going to explain the purpose. So in other words, you're going to answer that second part of the question. What might explain their differences? So you're looking at the background of the author, when it was created, and why might that affect the opinion given. So if you can do that for one of them, you can get 10 to 11 marks, and you need to do that for both to get 12 marks. This is quite a hard skill to actually obtain. You've got to be very sophisticated in your explanation. You're simply not going to be able to cut it by just saying the purpose of this one is to educate, where the purpose of this one is to commemorate or celebrate. That is not going to be the detail that you need. You must go into more depth and elaborate on your ideas. So just to make sure you're using comparison words, you're using quotations, because if you can do both those things, 7 to 9 marks should be where you're all aiming as a minimum. I'm not exaggerating by saying that when I did mark this paper, most people got within 7 to 9 marks. That's because it's very straightforward. As long as you're following the steps that I'm going to talk you through now, you should be able to do that. Okay, so this is how I would suggest that you answer your question. I would split it into 3 paragraphs. So I would expect you to make sure you're reading both interpretations, you're annotating them, and you've then broken down the question. So you need to work out what the topic is. So interpretations B and C both comment on or both discuss. I'll use the example that we did in lesson, religious settlement, as an example. Then you have to look for areas of difference. Okay, so how are they saying different things? So I would break this down into the following steps. So paragraph 1, I would just identify and talk about interpretation B. So you could simply read the interpretation and then what does it say about the topic in the question? Does it have a positive or a negative tone? What's their main argument? What are they saying about the topic named in the question? Then you need to find a quotation to support it. Remember, if you don't do that, you're going to limit your marks. And then you simply explain the quotation and link it back to the question. And that's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, you must use a comparison word, so in contrast. However, on the other hand, you need to make sure you're getting that comparison word in to make sure you're not stuck at 3 marks. And then all you need to do is repeat steps 1 to 3, but this time for interpretation C. So is it positive or negative tone? Does it argue a particular way that's different to the other one? Find a quote and then explain the quotation and link it back to the question. So if you were running out of time, or if you were struggling and you weren't too sure about the purpose and why it was created, I would advise that that would be sufficient. That would be enough. Paragraph 1 to 2 can get you 7 to 9 marks. However, I would like you to have a go at paragraph 3 if you've got time, because this will enable you to potentially access the higher marks. If you've got a high target, you must be pushing yourself to do this. So this is where I would like you to do an extra paragraph where you look at the purpose. So this is where you're actually going to look at who created it, when and why, and how this might influence the tone of the interpretation. So is there a particular background of the author that might explain why they think a certain way? And this is where you need to be using purpose words. So think about, to inform, to educate, to celebrate, commemorate. And this is where you need to explain why you think certain things might influence their overall argument and explain the differences between the two. So you would need to do this for 12 out of 12. You'd need to do this successfully for both interpretation B and C. Like I said, if that confuses you or you're not sure, you can always make sure you've done paragraph 1 and 2 but done it sufficiently, and that can get you up to 9 marks. And lastly, let's have a look at the 20-mark question. This is obviously the largest question on the paper. I often get asked by students, can I go straight to this question? The answer in short is yes, because you write down the question numbers as you go. You could in theory, but what I would say is make sure that you don't get too carried away and that you don't then spend too long on it. I recommend about 25 to 30 minutes. If you are going to opt to choose about 30 minutes, you will need to make sure you're not going over on the other questions. So yes, there's lots of marks up for grabs here, but please don't then only focus on this question. So what's it going to look like? How are you going to answer it? So this is an essay style question. It's going to be based on a quotation from an interpretation. However, you will not need to work out the purpose or the intended audience. You simply focus on what the statement says, and then you're going to find arguments to agree and disagree with the statement. I'll give you an example on the next slide. You're going to have to make a judgment, so the exact same way that you do this for the 18-mark questions in Nazi Germany and Crime and Punishment. And it's going to deal with some of the bigger issues of the topics. So those 5 components that I reminded you of at the start of the video, it could be on any of those areas, and it could be on a subtopic of those areas. So you could have something really specific and you need to make sure that you know how to answer it. For example, it might be on something like theatre, something really specific from one of the components. So this is why you really need to know the topic inside and out, because you don't want to get caught out on this 20-mark question and throw away all the marks. One of the positive things though, you will have 2 choices. So you'll be presented with 8A and 8B. You only need to do one of them. So this is actually favoursome for you because you get to choose the one that you feel you can do a better job of. So exact same structure as we've taught you for Crime and Punishment in Nazi Germany. So you're going to do a very, very brief introduction. This is literally a sentence simply saying how far you agree with the statement. Paragraph 1, I would always say you start with agreeing with the statement, but it doesn't really matter. It can be disagree or agree. You could do 2 paragraphs agree and 2 disagree. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then if you've got time, you've got that conclusion at the end. Because you need to be able to explain your opinions and explain your justifications overall, we do advise you to use that despite structure where you are trying to look at the bigger picture and then come out to your overall final judgment. So let's have a look at an example question. So you might get a question that's worded like this. So according to the website www.elizabethanera.org.uk, Elizabethan adventurers were motivated by the belief that new discoveries could bring untold riches. How far do you agree with the view of the motives of adventurers between 1580 and 1603? 20 marks. So the first thing I would get you to do is actually take the time to process the question and actually cross out the irrelevant bits and highlight the focus, the topic. So the bit that you don't need to focus on, like I said in the last slide, you don't need to actually use the provenance where that quote's come from. So you can actually cross out the bit where it's come from in the website. You don't need to discuss that. You don't need to look at how that influences the statements. You simply focus on what the topic is asking you about. The statement here then is that adventurers were motivated by the belief that new discoveries could bring untold riches. And then how far do you agree? So if you're going to agree with that statement, you're saying that actually the biggest motivation was wealth and gold. So you'd think of a paragraph to agree with that. If you're going to disagree with that paragraph, you could, for example, say, well, actually, there's other motivations, such as it could be getting patronage from Elizabeth. It could be actually in search of new trade. It could be in search of new opportunities. It could be to weaken Spain. So there's a whole load of different arguments you could come up with, but you would organise them in the structure I've discussed before. So optional then, if you're okay with your time or you feel as though you need to do this just to clarify your thought process, you could do a very, very quick plan. You could simply do this by literally just drawing a little line down the page and then doing like a tick and a cross, agree, disagree, and just bullet pointing your points that you're going to argue. So you could do either 2 agree and 2 disagree and do a complete balanced argument, or you could do a 3-1 argument. So the reason why I've got a picture for football there is we often say to you it's like football scores, so 3-1. So you could not do a 4-0 answer, so that means you can't write just 4 one-sided arguments, so you can't do 4 agree or 4 disagree, but you could do 3 either agree or disagree and only 1 of the opposing argument. It's entirely up to you. Just make sure you're choosing your strongest arguments, because you're going to need to write in peel paragraphs. So you're going to have 1 point per paragraph. You're going to use lots of contextual knowledge. You're going to explain how that links to the question. So in this case, you're talking about how it's the biggest motivation of adventurers. And then you're going to make sure you are saying if you agree or disagree. So you need to be able to do that 4 times. It's entirely up to you whether that's 3, 1, 2, 2. It's up to you. So then if you've got time, you're going to add a despite conclusion at the end, and then you're just going to literally summarise whether or not you agree or disagree, but you're going to justify this response. So this is where ideally you're going to use that despite conclusion, where you're acknowledging there's multiple arguments, but you're going to say which one you think is the most important or strong argument, and you're going to justify it. So have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see at the bottom 1 to 4 marks for description. You all can do that. So if you simply spoke about explorers, Francis Drake or Walter Raleigh, you will get 1 to 4 marks. You need to be writing your peel paragraphs to get anything higher than 5 marks. So you can see it's 5 to 8 for 1 peel paragraph, 9 to 12 for 2, 13 to 16 for 3, and you can get up to 90 marks for 4 arguments, either in 2-2 or 3-1, that are peel paragraphs. That final mark is for that judgment. So brief introduction, that literally is a sentence that says if you agree and disagree, and then that conclusion that matches and justifies your overall conclusion. So like I've said before, with these questions, it's about quality. You need to make sure that you are doing quality responses. There's no point writing 5 paragraphs on description and storytelling. You need to take the time to write peel paragraphs here. So some of you might be a bit slower when you're writing down your answers, so you might need to be smart about this. You might need to think, okay, I don't have enough time to do 4 peel paragraphs. I'm going to make sure I do 3 really well, and I'm going to sacrifice the conclusion. But make sure what you do, don't add the conclusion unless you've done 4 peel paragraphs, because as you can see, it will not award you any extra marks. So you're aiming for 4, but you do as many as you can. Obviously don't exceed 4, you won't get any marks for it, but you do as many as you can within that time frame, trying to get that peel structure. You need to make sure you're using words from the question and you're referring back to that statement and saying if you agree or disagree.